Hey all, I wanted to talk about the new attributes that are going to be coming on the PTR patch and how builds are going to change. Starting off with the new attributes, there are going to be 25 thresholds and 350 thresholds, as well as the total amount of attribute uh per points that you have will be 600 instead of 500. This does not include the 5 base, so there is a funny trick with some of this that I'll get into later, where you can dip into every single attribute and you effectively end up with a 25 stat bonus because you get 5 from base from dipping into every single stat, which can lead you to have some decent combos with specific weapons, but I wouldn't say it's something that is generally going to be good. It's just a niche thing that could be good for certain weapons. So starting off here, I want to go through the things that have changed. For the 25 strength attribute, we have 5% light attacks. For 50, we have 10% heavy attacks. For 100, 10% physical damage. For 150, 15% stamina recovery. For 200, 10% CC damage, so that's if someone's under a CC effect, will deal more damage. 250, you have 25% stam recovery, or stam attacks, so your attacks will do more stamina to someone that's blocking. 300, we have 10% retaliate damage, and in 350, we have 30% damage on your last light attack. I think everything above the 200 strength threshold for strength is still not super good. The 300 strength seems interesting, because I think that will be able to consistently proc, but stam attacks is just generally not a good thing to really get to. It's an okay bonus, but it's not that strong. And then the 350 perk, I just don't find, or I don't think that will be super consistent for a lot of players to use. I think that could be interesting as something like on Great Axe in particular, it's something that you kind of hit people a lot with your second attack, so it could be good there, but that's not usually what you're doing damage with your second attack, so I don't see it being something that's super strong there. Warhammer again seems kind of interesting, but there's two Warhammer light attacks and are kind of spaced apart, and people usually cancel out of the first one, so I don't think that last light attack bonus is really going to be that strong, so I imagine people aren't going to dip into those later on ones as much. For Dex, 25, we have 5% crit, 50, 5% diamond, which is if you're full HP, you'll do 5% more damage. 100, we have 5% opal, so if you're not full stam, you'll do 5% more damage. 150, you have 15% dot duration, which is kind of interesting because that will affect those bleed effects as well as those poison effects that you see often OPR. For 200, you see 10% backstab or headshot damage. At 250, we have 10% shirking and power, so if you dodge an attack, you get shirking and power. That seems like a very solid bonus to get. That's coming to the game next patch. 300, you have 10% dodge stam reduction, so you're going to lose 10% stam, which just makes this very strong. And at 350, we have 15% crit chance when empowered. So basically, you're going to be able to do more damage when you're empowered. Those builds typically do have good sources of empower, and it's relatively easy to hit. With in particular for kind of bow, musket, ranged oriented builds. Melee builds, I don't think the empower is super consistent, but it is a run. A lot of people run greatsword with keenly empowered right now, so I think it's possible to take advantage of this, but it's something I don't see people actually going all the way down for, because that 15% crit chance when empowered is just worse than 10% CC damage in most cases, because the 10% CC damage will be more consistent, and most of those weapons skill off of both strength and dex, and due to diminishing returns, where you go down to those later on thresholds, I would assume that going more into a different category if your weapon skills off of both will just generally be better. But that 350 thing will probably be used by both muskets to a degree and bows to a degree, which will be interesting. Going into the int category, 25, we have 5% crit damage. 50, we have 10% dot damage. 100, we have 10% basic elemental attacks. 150, we have 15% all elemental damage. 200, we have 10% mana per crit, so that's changed to be per crit instead of per dodge. 250, 30% dot duration, nothing new there. 300, we have 10% execute. Some people are taking this execute as to being if someone's under 10% HP, they're going to instantly die, and other people are taking it as to mean if you're under 30% HP, which is a gem type, then you gain that 10% extra damage, which I think it's more likely the latter, so it's going to turn mages more so into this finisher-oriented class, or it could be used as a finisher, which I think kind of suits the fire staff a little bit better. 350 is 15% ability damage, which just screams fire staff, a fire staffs are going to want that all day, every day. For int overall, I think this benefits Firestaff a lot. I think it benefits BB a lot. For the Great Axe that's got leaked for that has the special relic, like I don't find that to be super solid with the int later on, to be honest. Some people look at these int things and think it's like looks fantastic, but when we get up to the con, I'll circle back around and explain why I don't think that Great Axe on paper is going to be super solid, but it does look fun in theory. Moving on to Focus, 25, we get 5% cooldown reduction, so that's cheaper now, and it's a really good thing just to dip into for most classes. At 50, we have 10% Divine, again, a really useful thing for a lot of classes. 100, 20% mana and regen, so you have more mana and you'll regen your mana faster. 150, we have 20% healing. 200, we have 20% buff duration. 250, we have 1% heal per second on assist and 15% to kills. I don't know if kills in your group count towards this or if it has to be a finishing blow, but that will be kind of an interesting lifesteal related aspect that could come about. I find this to most likely just be useful in PvE rather than PvP, because in PvP not enough people die consistently for this to really help you, I imagine. It also could be interesting for open world though, where you have 20-man raid groups running around trying to push these new forts. I imagine those bonuses will proc a lot more if you're in a 20-man raid group, and I don't know if it'll proc only if you get the assist, if people in your group get an assist, if one person in your raid group gets the assist, so that will be really interesting to watch. 300 focus, we have 20% lifeline fortify per 60 seconds. I honestly don't know completely what this means. I imagine it's like if you get under 50% HP, you gain 20% fortify for 60 seconds, like the amulet perk bonus. But I don't think that's like super useful, but it's not like a bad perk by any means. At 350, we have 50% cooldown reduction on the heart rune now, which is insane. We'll just make it so that healers can either provide a lot of utility that they weren't able to before, or will be able to really make sure they don't die by always having that stalwart up. This is also interesting for that kind of AoE based new weapon that's coming out with the flail, because all those AoEs will likely charge your heart rune very fast. You'll get that 50% cooldown reduction in heart rune if you go into focus, and then you can use that potentially with a more tanky oriented setup where you don't necessarily have to take that stone form to have more utility within an OPR, army, open world, etc. Like whatever situation you want. Even in PvE, this could be very useful. Moving on to con, at 25 we have 10% consumes get divide. This is a nerf from the current one, where at 50 con you get 20% consume divine, which is noteworthy. At 50 you get 10% armor above 50% HP, so you gain armor the more HP you have. When you fall below that 50% H3, you're going to start taking damage a little bit faster. That's going to apply to basically every build in the game, so you're going to be a little bit tankier at first, and then that tankiness is going to fall off if you're not consistently healed, which is noteworthy. So you typically want to be topped up more, which means that those AoE oriented builds will just be a little bit more impactful, because they'll tend to keep you up passively without rather needing the active heals from like a single targeted oriented class. At 100 con we have 10% armor. It's going to get translated to HP. Very strong for certain classes, less strong for other classes. This is a really solid buff to con in general. At 150, 10% resilient, nothing special. 200, they have 10% armor, nothing new. 250, 60% damage reduction at 100% HP. I think it is noteworthy for this, for the leak thing, where there is like a per 60 seconds on a lot of these categories. This does not have a per like time period on here. I would assume that it's going to be similar to the last patch, where it might be per 60 seconds. Maybe it got buffed, now it's per 30 seconds. But there is a chance that this just is 60% damage reduction when you're at 100% HP, which means that you're just not going to get one shot if you get to this, which would be a very interesting way to counter one-shot builds, but I don't think it would even work versus those builds, because they typically land a CC effect that will get you below 100% HP and then go for the one-shot combo. But it would be an interesting approach to try to counter those builds, as well as a lot of healers will get access to this 250 con bonus now, so healers might potentially be a decent amount more tanky than they are in the current patch. At 300 con we have grit on light attacks, mandatory for a large majority of melee builds, and at 350 con we get 15% damage reduction if you have grit. So that sounds insane for Warhammer, sounds insane for Great Axe, especially because these later on strength thresholds just in general don't seem very strong to me. The part that's like kind of interesting here is this kind of makes it so that in line with the current patch will be about the damage that you do with the next patch, relatively with melee weapons, because you're not going to get a damage boost really from 25% stam attacks. You're actually getting a damage nerf on your light attacks because your light attacks lost a 5% a damage boost here, but you're in turn getting some buffs in other places. So I think overall Great Axe Warhammer will be more tanky, but will not necessarily output more damage. But because everyone else is also going to be outputting more damage, I think this is going to be about a net neutral change for Great Axe. I want to start getting into some like hypothetical builds here and talk about like some current builds, what they currently run, and what I think they'll run on the new patch. So hopping into this to begin with, Great Axe Warhammer, I've already kind of talked about this a bit. 200 strength, 300 con is the current meta. Next patch, I imagine this is just going to go to 250 strength, 350 con, and people aren't really going to worry about it. You take that damage reduction where you can, you dump those extra stat points back into strength. You don't really worry about those 25 bonuses. You could get those 25 bonuses because that 25% stam attacks is just not a very good bonus. Like, you could take 5% crit on dex, you could take that 5% die. I mean, if you're on max HP and go up to 50 dex, you could take that 5% crit damage and try to flank more, try to hit people from behind. You could take that 5% cooldown reduction if you really wanted to get creative there and stack refreshing instead of freedom, like no one really does right now. But I don't imagine people are going to really go down that path, and people are just going to slap on that strength, try to boost their damage, slap on an extra con, try to make it so they can't die, and don't really get too creative with this build in particular. There is a way too with the int-based Great Axe that got leaked for an artifact. By leaked, I mean the devs kind of foreshadowed it, so this is like barely a leak at this point. You could go 300 int and 300 con, drop that con down a bit. At 300 int gives you up to execute, which would be kind of interesting. Or you could go up to that 350 int, get that ability damage, but then you won't have grit on your light attacks anymore. If you go for this 350 ability, or 350 int for the ability damage though, you could slap that on with a Ice Gauntlet per se. You're more tanky that way, so you can drop that con down a little bit. And then you can rely on something like exploding stone form for the grit if you really needed the grit for extra damage, or something else. This will be kind of interesting to see how this pairs with the actual Great Axe itself. I imagine if that Great Axe does not have a name, or does not have thwarting strikes, then you will go down this path where you just ignore the grit, because you're not going to get a damage bonus on your grit, so it's just not generally worth to go for. But if it has that perk, then I think it's going to define how much con, how much int you really go with that build, so that will be really, really interesting to foresee in the near future. Moving on to everyone's either favorite or least favorite build, Blunderbuss Ice Gauntlet. One-shots you left, right, and center. It's going to do that even more next patch, I think. So at the current patch, people usually go 200 strength, 150 int, 150 con. Usually they up to 165 con with the extra bonuses that you get because you have a 5% bonus per category that you dip into. So this overall leads to that 10% CC damage, which is really important, that 50% elemental damage, and then from there you just have really, really good scaling compared to the attributes that you put in. Next patch, I think people are going to go crazy with the int, try to get down to that execute threshold, that 15% ability damage, and in turn for that you could also get up to that 200 strength if you want to, and just run 50 con. I think it's very possible that people are going to be running around as like light assassin builds with this Blunderbuss Ice Gauntlet setup, just because these bonuses just tend to work for this, or even drop the Ice Gauntlet and go for like a Hatchet or something like that. Like, I think that's very, very possible to be a one-shot oriented build based off the things that are leaked for next patch. You could also go something that would be a little bit more on the other side, where you say go to 350 strength, you get that 30% damage on that last light attack. That could apply to your last hit on the BB, because BBs typically have 2 shots in them. That last one has a damage bonus already. This will increase that damage bonus even more. You can still get that 150 int, so you have decent int damage, and then throw on the con for the rest of what you have there, which will not be a ton of con, but it will be okay. Like, you'll have 100 con still, so you have like 2 different setups there that could be good if you want to be more ability focused, or if you want to be more light attack focused, depending on your blunderbuss, which is a little bit more unique compared to some of these weapons where your stat split could change. For Void Gauntlet Rapier, I put out a lot of quirky ones here for the new ones, but the old one that people ran a lot was 200 int, 50 focus, 250 con. On greedier servers, people could get away with 250 int and 200 con, but it felt like on most servers you kind of needed that extra con just to live if you're a medium oriented player, and heavy people typically ran to 250 con as well, just because on heavy you're typically running it on point. I imagine it's going to be similar amounts of con for next patch because you don't really get a bonus from going for those grit-based passives. So I imagine people are going to go 250 int, 250 con, and because the 250 int will give that dot duration bonus, which will extend the duration of those dot-based effects on Void Gauntlet, which are just heavily prevalent, that apply Disintegrate, which will lead to a Ren being applied for an increased duration of time. This will also increase the effect of something like a Bile from an ult, so that is another way to get value out of this perk. You could also get to 100 focus with the setup on the next patch. Will give you that 20% mana regen, which could be good. Or you could just go 50 focus, get that 10% divine, that 5% cooldown reduction, and take some of these other passives, like 5% crit on Dex looks pretty decent. 5% light attacks does not necessarily apply to strength anymore. It could apply to Void Gauntlet light attacks, so that could be okay. If you want to get really, really quirky with it, this is one of the only builds I think where you could go full Exodia here, take a bit of everything here, and the really cool part about dipping into every attribute is you get 25 extra stat bonuses here. So that 5% light attack damage, like that's not irrelevant for a Void Gauntlet, it's not bad. 5% crit, very good for a Void Gauntlet. 5% cooldown reduction, very good. You're obviously going to get focus, you're obviously going to get int. So then at that point, you just have to sacrifice basically that strength stat, and then you get access to these 25% extra thresholds, which you could put into focus. You could put that into Dex as well, so that you end up in this weird spot where you have 250 int, 250 con, 50 focus, 50 Dex, and 25 strength. That's something that I don't think most people are going to run, but it is something that you can run that would be viable with these changes. Moving on to Lifestaff Rapier, the old build was 300 focus, 200 con, nothing super glamorous there. There was always a big debate, do you go 310 focus or do you go 210 con? The healers loved debating that. It was very fun to watch from a spectator point of view, as they debated if someone wanted to pad more. People would get really mad if they saw VOD and saw someone was 310 focus, because I mean they're overriding other people's heals, and it was a great time for everyone else except for the healers to figure that bug out. And the new stat is just going to be 350 focus, 250 con. Like, I don't think there's much debating there, but the healers once again will have this lovely debate. Do you go 360 focus or do you go 260 con? And we'll see who comes out on top for that one. Moving on to Fire Staff. 350 int, 150 con was pretty meta. This will likely shift to 350 int, 250 con for most players, or if they don't really want to be more tanky, which I think most Fire Staff players don't really care about being tanky, you could go something quirky like 350 int, 200 con, 25 dex, 25 focus, or you could just increase this int threshold more and say just run 150 con still, but then have 450 int. All these seem viable to a degree. I would elect to say if you can take con, it's probably not a bad thing to take con, and those attribute bonuses are generally pretty good to get to. The Fire Staff does have an opportunity to take some of these 25 bonuses, like 25 focus will be that 5% CDR. Fire Staffs typically run a lot of refreshing, so I think this seems good. 25 dex was the crit chance increase, which I think is also decent for a Fire Staff in theory, because those resilient perks are getting reduced for light players and for medium players compared to live, which will make it so that your Fire Staff damage just does more damage if you crit. So it might as well just double down into that and get that 25 dex. So I think all of these are, or both these are kind of viable to a degree, and it will just be a preference of what you go. For moving on to Spear, Greatsword, this is like a very meta build for the current patch. It's been consistently nerfed, but still seems to shine above other builds because Greatsword has been nerfed so much that it's been moved more so to a secondary weapon rather than a primary weapon in terms of PvP. Before you would typically just go 300 dex, 200 con for those extra dodges once that change rolled out. In the next patch you could do the same thing, but you could dip 100 into strength, which will increase your damage by a large margin. So this overall will just lead to you doing more damage with the spear, more damage with your greatsword, and I think most of those players will be happy that they don't have to sacrifice much and they just get a straight DPS boost in this next patch. Moving on to Hatchet Greatsword, this is a more assassin-oriented build in the current patch. If people are running this, which there were not many people that were running this still, I would say that there's less than probably 5 people in NA that tried to run this at some point. Most of them swapped off, including the people that were just always ran like 5 con builds because it just did not feel good versus light blunderbusses. But there were some people in other regions like the Whelps, which many of you might know as a really popular streamer from AP Southeast. Like, he runs this build a lot, You can drop the con down as much as you want. You get those extra dodges, you get the extra damage. It was a very assassin-oriented build. On the new patch, you can go 300 dex, 200 strength, and get that 100 con now, so you're a lot tankier than you used to be before, but you keep the damage that you had before. So I think this is overall just like a natural buff to this class because you have those extra attributes. And then the last but not least, just for the tank lovers in the chat, you get to move from 500 con to 550 con and 50 focus, so you get that passive divine that you no longer have to run on amulet, I guess. So there's a change there that you can have for SNS, where you can go 600 con and just be weird and not experiment with anything ever. But that's all I have for this one, guys. Let me know if you have some other builds that you want to talk about. Like, there is some potential for musket that get kind of crazy with these. You go down those dex paths or that int path and you can just start doing tons of damage. And I'm sure there's other attribute thresholds I didn't think about either. And let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video.